Okay, we're going to be answering a pretty serious question today, which is where did life come from? And obviously, that's a lot to ask. And the truth is, we don't really have one answer to that question. This is a difficult and challenging question for biologists to answer. And I want to just really go through what makes this such a challenging question. Why is it so hard to figure out where life came from? And we're going to look at the different parts of what it takes to answer this question. And I'm not going to really be able to give you a definitive answer to it, but I am going to be able to tell you what biologists are thinking right now and what they're currently working with. And of course, like all science, these ideas are going to continue to change over time and become, hopefully, more and more accurate. But to start off with, we really need to ask an even more basic question, which is, what is life? So if we're going to ask when did life start or how did life start, well, we need to know what life is. So we're going to say that life does basically three things. First of all, life reproduces. So if I have a plant, a beautiful flower maybe, it needs to create baby flowers. And not just any flower, they need to be flowers like it. So there needs to be some similarity. They don't have to be exactly the same as the parent, but they need to be similar. So there needs to be some kind of transfer of what we call genetic information that tells these baby flowers to be kind of like their parents. Another thing that living things do is they use energy to create order. So if you think about the natural way of things, let's imagine, your room. Left all alone without any outside effort on your part, your room is going to get dirtier and dirtier and dirtier. We can also give the example that this set of blocks, if you put energy into a bunch of blocks, you can stack them nicely and prettily. But it doesn't really take much energy at all for those blocks to just sit around on the counter. So living things take stuff that's pretty disorganized, like a bunch of blocks just sitting on the counter, and they use energy to make them more organized than they were before. And the last thing that living things do is they grow. And they use energy to do this. So both of these things, reproducing and using energy, are a part of living things growing. Growing from being, small children to being large, ugly adults. So we say in biology that the smallest living things are cells. Anything smaller than a cell can't do those three things we just mentioned. For example, atoms are smaller than a cell. Atoms do not use energy to create order. Atoms do not reproduce themselves and make baby atoms. Atoms do not grow and develop and change. Okay, so they are not alive. The smallest things that can do all that stuff would be a cell. Okay, that's not to say that every cell does all of those things in your body. Only some of the cells are used for reproduction. But still, the smallest unit that could possibly do all that stuff is a cell. Now, just for some size comparison, you can see on this chart right here, this is you, full-grown human being. An ostrich egg, this is not to scale, by the way. Just so we're clear, an ostrich egg is not as tall as your knee. An ostrich egg is about 1/100th as big as you are. Okay? An ostrich egg, there's some debate about whether an ostrich egg is actually one cell, but many people would say that that's the largest cell on Earth. Certainly the largest cell in your body is a human egg, which you'd see about right here. A human egg is 1/1000th as big as an ostrich egg. And it's right at the border of things that you can see. A human egg is big enough to be seen with the naked eye, but just barely. Think of it like the smallest mark you could make with a pencil. Okay? And over here, we've got an SEM, scanning electron micrograph image of a human egg. This yellow thing right here is a human egg. And of course, right next to it, this white thing is a human sperm. Now, what's cool about this picture is the fact that the egg is the largest cell in your body, and the sperm is the smallest human cell in your body. So there they are, right next to each other. Isn't that cool? Now, of course, there are things even smaller than this sperm inside your bacteria inside your body, and those would be bacteria. Bacteria might be 1/100th as big as this sperm. So bacteria can be very, very small compared to your body's cells. And bacteria are pretty much the smallest living things. Some scientists would say that a virus, which is about 1/100th the size of a bacteria, or of a bacterium, is a living thing, but some people disagree about whether viruses are alive or not. And we can talk about that more later. But for right now, we're going to say a bacteria is the smallest living thing. All right, now we need to talk about, if we're going to talk about how life came to be, we need to talk about what are the problems of making life. Why is life so unlikely? Because it is. It's really hard for living things to occur. We know that just by looking out into the universe and seeing all the different planets in our solar system and realizing that none of them seem to have living things on them. So life seems to be pretty unlikely. So in order to make life, you need a few things. You need a cell, obviously, because we said that's the smallest living thing. You need chemical reactions inside that cell. You need genetic material, something that can be passed on from a parent to its children that can make them similar. So we'll start with making a cell. How do you make a cell when there are no living things? Where did the first cell come from? Well, the idea is that it might have come from something called a protobiont. Okay, protobiont is basically a bubble. These are naturally occurring bubbles. Think about pouring olive oil into a thing of water. The olive oil separates from the water and it groups together, and it groups together in these little tiny circular clumps that actually look a lot like cells. And this happens with a lot of things. If you dump a bunch of protein into water, it can also form these little bubbles. And these are bubbles that are so small you have to see them in a microscope. Or if you dump a bunch of lipids, lipids are just fats. It's a fancy name for fat. They form these little bubbles too, these microscopic bubbles. And we think that what might have happened was these naturally forming bubbles could have trapped some of the ingredients for life, and that bubble became the first living thing. Sound pretty unlikely? Yeah, it sounds unlikely to me too. But if you think about it, there probably would have been trillions of bubbles. So the chances get a little bit better when you go into big numbers like the trillions. The next thing you need is chemical reactions. So you need to be able to take a small molecule like this. This is glucose. Glucose is a very simple sugar. And you need to be able to first create that glucose out of the atoms that it's made up of. And then you should be able to turn it into more complicated molecules like this cellulose. Anyone who has ever eaten celery is familiar with cellulose, those long strings in the celery that make it so crunchy are long strings held together by cellulose. So how did this happen? Well, we're pretty sure, we've done a lot of experiments on this, and there's pretty good evidence that in the early Earth's atmosphere, you would have had the right combination of ingredients in order for things like this glucose to naturally occur. And it might have been that lightning strikes created it, or it might have been heat from volcanoes that allowed that to happen. One thing's for sure, it's important that there was very low oxygen in the early atmosphere, because oxygen tends to tear molecules like this apart. And so if you had less oxygen, which we know you did back then when the Earth first formed, it's more likely to form molecules like glucose. Now, it's harder to explain how glucose could have turned into larger things like cellulose, and there are two examples of how that might have happened. The first is the organic soup model, which is this idea that in the early oceans, the conditions were very different back then, more specific. And that's, again, partially because there was a lot less oxygen. And those early conditions in the oceans might have made it possible for small molecules like glucose to turn into larger molecules. So it's the idea that it just all happened in dissolved molecules inside the ocean. Another idea is the solid metal catalysis model, which is the idea that, and we know this happens, is that metals have these little uneven shapes on them. These would be like microscopic little grooves. And that molecules like glucose, this would be one glucose molecule, can come and fit into those grooves. So you could have two glucoses right next to each other. And when those glucoses are held next to each other by this metal, they might want to form bonds. And we know this happens. Every single night I take my contacts out and I put them in a little container, and in that container is some metal, and I pour hydrogen peroxide into the container, and the metal turns the hydrogen peroxide into water and oxygen gas. And so that's an example of solid metal catalysis that I use to clean my contacts every night. So we know this happens, and we think it might have happened in the early Earth to form things like cellulose. And once this cellulose molecule is formed, it can then break away and another one can be made. So these are two ideas of how chemical reactions might have happened before living things. The last thing you need in order to make life is you need genetic material. So right now the way it works is you've got DNA, and DNA contains all the information you need to know what kind of living thing you're going to be. And that DNA gets translated into something similar called RNA. Now, RNA is just one strand, not two, like DNA is. And that RNA goes outside the nucleus and it gets transcribed. We'll explain these words, transcribed and translated, a lot more later, into a protein. And so that's the path that the information in DNA takes to become the protein it's supposed to make. Now, that's pretty complicated. It involves a lot of work to make the RNA and then make the protein, and you have to copy the DNA too, and all this stuff. So a lot of scientists believe that when life first formed, it probably only used RNA. And then you could just take the RNA and turn it directly into a protein. And the RNA is what would be passed on to parent, or passed on from parent to child, whereas the DNA is what's passed on now. And so that's a simpler idea that makes it a little bit easier to understand how living things could have first formed, which is a big question. Living things are really complicated now, and so the easier we can imagine a living thing being, the easier it is for us to imagine it forming all on its own. Now, this idea, by the way, is called the RNA world hypothesis. I love that name. So it hypothesizes that once there was a world where all living things used RNA instead of DNA. Now, again, this might not have answered all your questions, but it does give you the general problems that life faced when it was first formed, and some of the ways scientists have tried to explain life overcoming those problems.